It started like any other neighborhood dispute, a homeowner versus the HOA. But when they decided to send cement trucks over a century-old wooden bridge, one man saw disaster coming. He tried reasoning, emailing, even pleading, but the board refused to listen. That's when he set a trap. 3 hidden cameras, 1 shaky bridge, and a plan so meticulous it would expose their negligence in glorious 4K. What happened next stunned the entire community. A single crack echoed through the morning air, and in that instant, everything— the bridge, the lies, the HOA's reputation— began to collapse. But this wasn't just revenge. It was justice, engineered to perfection. Stay tuned, because what you're about to see is how one man turned an HOA's arrogance into their downfall, and became the unlikely hero who saved his neighborhood, with proof they couldn't bury. Our neighborhood is one of those picture-perfect places. Winding roads, big old oak trees, a real sense of community. The heart of it all is this narrow, single-lane bridge over a wide, gurgling creek. It's made of dark wood and iron, with a gentle arch that's been there for nearly a century. It's not just a way to get across the water. It's a landmark. People take wedding photos there. Kids dangle their feet off the side in the summer. I even proposed to my wife at sunset in the middle of that bridge. It's the kind of thing that makes a place feel like a home, not just a row of houses. And it's obviously old. You can feel it when you drive over it. There's a gentle sway and a creak from the planks that reminds you to slow down and show some respect for its age. And then there's our HOA. On the surface, they were pretty standard. A small board of volunteer residents led by a woman we'll just call Karen. Karen was one of those people who seemed to get a thrill from enforcing rules about lawn height and mailbox colors, wielding her tiny bit of power like a bored queen. I'd had one minor run-in with her a year prior. She'd sent me a formal violation letter, complete with a threat of a $50 fine, because the decorative wreath on my door was, and I quote, seasonal in nature, but displayed outside of the approved seasonal window. The wreath had pine cones on it. It was March. For the most part, it was just minor annoyances and passive-aggressive newsletters. I had no reason to think they were capable of anything more. I was so wrong. The nightmare started, as these things often do, with a cheerful-looking email. The subject was Exciting Community Improvement Project. Honestly, my first reaction was relief. The HOA was finally going to repave our pothole-ridden roads. It was long overdue. Driving through the neighborhood felt like navigating the surface of the moon. I read through the details, the timeline, the company they'd hired, and it all seemed totally professional. And then I hit the last paragraph, a little section titled Logistics and Staging. It laid out the route for the construction vehicles, and that's when my blood ran cold. To get to the far side of the neighborhood, all heavy machinery, including, and they actually specified this, multiple fully loaded cement trucks, would be driven directly over the old wooden bridge. I read it again, and then a third time, my mouth hanging open. Cement trucks, over our bridge. A full cement mixer can weigh up to 80,000 pounds. I didn't know the bridge's exact weight limit. Nobody did, but I knew it wasn't that. You could feel the whole thing vibrate when a pickup truck went over it. This wasn't a plan. It was a death sentence for the bridge. A collapse wouldn't just be an inconvenience. That bridge is the only way in or out for 24 homes, mine included. That means no emergency services, no getting to work, nothing. If my kid had an asthma attack, if there was a fire, we'd be completely stranded. It meant the soul of our community would be in a heap at the bottom of the creek because of sheer, mind-blowing incompetence. My first instinct wasn't rage. It wasn't to call a lawyer. I just wanted to inform them. I was sure it had to be an oversight. A simple mistake made by someone in an office who'd never actually seen the bridge. I picked up the phone and called Robert, an older guy who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and knew its history better than anyone. Am I crazy, Robert? I asked after explaining the email. There's no way that bridge can take a cement truck, right? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Crazy! You're the sanest person I've talked to all week, he said, his voice grim. They're going to destroy it. That thing has been patched and prayed over for decades. This isn't an oversight. It's insanity. His confirmation solidified my resolve. So I sat down, ready to be the reasonable, helpful homeowner. I'd point out their mistake. They'd thank me, and we'd find another way. I had no idea I was about to walk into a brick wall of bureaucracy that would teach me a hard lesson. When a board cares more about its own authority than your safety, being reasonable is the first thing to fail. I started with a polite, carefully worded email. No accusations, no drama, just a concerned resident. I titled it, Question Regarding Bridge Safety and Repaving Project. I mentioned the bridge's obvious age, the immense weight of cement trucks, and the catastrophic risk of structural failure and resident entrapment. I even did the work for them, mapping out a simple alternative. There was another entrance to our neighborhood on the far side. It was a slightly longer drive for the trucks, maybe 10 minutes, but it was all on modern roads and bridges designed for heavy loads. A total no-brainer. I attached a few photos of the bridge, showing the weathered planks and rusted iron, just to make my point. I hit send, feeling pretty good that this would be over quickly. The problem was obvious, and so was the solution. The response came less than 24 hours later. It wasn't from the engineering company. It was a single curt sentence from Karen, the HOA president. It read, in its entirety, "Thank you for your concern. The board has consulted with our engineers, and the approved plan is final." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance, just a digital pat on the head. Don't you worry about it. That phrase, "Our engineers have approved it," was meant to shut me down. But keeping common areas safe isn't just a suggestion. It's the HOA's fundamental job. This email wasn't just rude. It felt like a total dereliction of that duty. I replied immediately, "Thank you for the prompt response, Karen. To help put my and other residents' minds at ease, could you please forward a copy of the engineering report you mentioned?" Her reply came back in under 5 minutes. The board's internal documentation is not subject to resident review. The matter is closed. My concern turned into actual alarm. This wasn't an oversight. This was a cover-up. They were intentionally withholding information and sticking to a dangerous plan, no matter the risk. A few days later, a little warning shot was fired across my bow. I found a violation notice stuck to my door. The reason? My lawn was apparently a quarter of an inch over the maximum allowable height. I had mowed it 2 days earlier. It was a petty, transparent act of intimidation. Karen was telling me to back off. It had the opposite effect. I decided to go to step 2, a public appeal. The monthly HOA meeting was the next week, held in the sterile, fluorescent-lit clubhouse that always smelled like stale coffee. I spent the week getting ready. This time, they wouldn't just be reading an email. They'd be facing reality. I dug up historical photos of the bridge from the library's online archives, showing its construction back in the 1920s. I took new, high-res pictures of the decay, the cracks in the support beams, the rust eating away at the trusses, the crumbling concrete footings. The night of the meeting was exactly what I expected. The 5 board members sat at a long table, looking bored. Karen was in the middle, flanked by her cronies. A few other residents were scattered around, mostly there to complain about fines for leaving their recycling bins out. When new business came up, I raised my hand. I stood up and calmly laid out my case. I wasn't emotional, just factual. I showed them the old photos. I passed around my pictures of the decay. I explained, in the simplest terms, the physics of what happens when you put too much weight on an old structure. I showed them the alternate route again, stressing that a minor inconvenience would guarantee everyone's safety. I even mentioned my follow-up email. "I'm sure the engineering report you mentioned would clarify everything," I said, looking directly at Karen. "If we could just see the part that certifies the bridge for 80,000-pound loads, this entire discussion would be over. I spoke for 5 minutes, looking each board member in the eye. I wanted them to see I was serious and informed, not just some crank. When I finished, there was a dead, empty silence. The treasurer, a smug man named Gary, was scrolling through his phone. Karen just stared at me with pure irritation, as if I'd wasted her time complaining about the weather. "Are you finished?" she snapped. "As I said in my email, we have professionals for this." The engineering firm signed off on the plan. It is the most cost-effective and efficient route. "We are not reopening this discussion," Gary chimed in without looking up from his phone. "And how much do you think your little detour will cost in man-hours and fuel surcharges?" "We're on a budget." Karen then looked at the rest of the board. "All in favor of proceeding as planned?" 4 hands shot up. It was a sham. My evidence, my logic, my plea for basic safety. It all meant nothing. It felt like a dictatorship in miniature. I sat down, stunned by the arrogance. They didn't have an answer to my concerns. They just refused to hear them. After the meeting, a couple of neighbors quietly came up to me. Robert was one of them. "You're right about that bridge," he whispered. They patched it up in '88 after a school bus cracked one of the planks. It was never meant for heavy loads. Another woman, Sarah, said she was worried but was afraid of the board. She'd been fined $100 because her wind chimes were too loud. As we were talking, Karen walked past, pausing just long enough to give Robert and Sarah a look of pure ice that made them both clam up and find excuses to leave. This was the culture of fear they'd created. People were more scared of a fine than a bridge collapse. The final nail in the coffin came a few days later. A bright orange sign was staked into the grass at the neighborhood entrance. "Road work begins in 2 weeks." This was it. The countdown was on. I had tried being polite. I had tried being logical. I had failed. And in that moment of despair, a new, radical idea started to form. If they wouldn't listen to words, I'd have to give them something they couldn't ignore. I couldn't convince them. I had to catch them. I had to set a trap. This trap idea wasn't some flash of brilliance. It was born from desperation, and something I remembered from a story online where a lawyer gave one piece of advice: get a camera. Evidence is the one thing that cuts through ego and lies. The board could dismiss my words, but they couldn't argue with a video of their own screw-up. My trap wasn't going to be a net or a snare. It was going to be an unbreakable web of digital proof. The mission was clear: get a multi-angle record of what was about to happen. I needed to document the before to show the existing condition, and then capture the during with perfect clarity. I went down a rabbit hole of home security and wildlife trail cameras. I'm no tech expert, but I learned fast, watching YouTube reviews and reading forums on how to waterproof connections and maximize battery life. I knew what I needed: weatherproof, motion-activated, night vision, and as stealthy as possible. I bought 3 camouflaged battery-powered HD trail cameras. The setup had to be perfect. The night before construction was due to start, I felt like a spy. I dressed in dark clothes, my gear in a backpack, and waited until well after midnight. Every rustle of leaves made my heart pound. At one point, a car turned down the street, its headlights sweeping across the trees. I had to dive into a prickly bush and lie flat, my face in the dirt, until it passed. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was real. Camera 1 was the wide shot. I strapped it high on a thick pine tree about 50 yards from the bridge, using a climbing strap to hoist myself up 10 feet. It gave me a clear, establishing view of the road leading to it and the bridge itself. This would show the truck approaching and establish the scale of the scene. Camera 2 was the close-up. This was the most important one. There was a nasty-looking horizontal crack in one of the main wooden support pillars near the bank. The one Robert told me had been patched decades ago. I scrambled down the muddy, slippery creek side, nearly losing my footing twice. I wedged the camera into a thicket of bushes, aimed directly at that crack. I zoomed it in so the crack filled the frame. My goal was to capture any splintering or stress in undeniable detail. Camera 3 was for the aftermath. I crossed the bridge, each creak now feeling a lot more ominous, and hid the last camera in some dense foliage on the other side, aimed back at the bridge's exit. It would see the truck's entire journey, and if the bridge collapsed or the truck got stuck, it would see that too. Then I added one last low-tech touch. A telltale. I found a small, flat piece of scrap wood in my garage. I went back down to that cracked support pillar. The spot next to the crack was uneven, so I had to use a tiny dab of mud to create a level surface. I carefully, with trembling hands, balanced the little piece of wood right on that ledge. It was like a primitive earthquake detector. If the bridge vibrated violently enough, that little piece of wood would fall. It was a simple, physical backup for the video. Something undeniably real. With the cameras set and armed, I snuck back to my house. The trap was laid. I spent the rest of the night creating a digital case file. The before photos of the cracks, a video of the bridge swaying as my own car went over it, copies of all my emails with the HOA, including my request for the report, and Karen's refusal. I was convinced they weren't just being stubborn. They were being negligent, and I was creating the evidence that could prove it. As I sat there, watching the empty bridge from my window, I felt a wave of anxiety. Had I done enough? Would the batteries die? Or worse, what if I was wrong? What if the trucks rolled over without a problem, and I just ended up looking like a paranoid idiot? I had no idea. All I could do was wait for the sun to come up and the rumbling to start. That night before the trucks came, the anxiety was insane. Every creak of my house sounded like the bridge groaning. It got me thinking. Have you ever been in a situation where you just knew something was dangerously wrong, but the people in charge refused to listen? That feeling of being ignored when the stakes are so high? Let me know your story in the comments. It's good to know you're not alone in these fights. The morning came with a heavy gray sky that matched my mood. I was a nervous wreck, pacing around my own house. I had my phone recording a time-lapse out my front window and a pair of binoculars in my hand. It was just after 8 a.m. when I heard it, a low, deep thrum that vibrated through the floor. It grew louder, a guttural diesel growl that did not belong in our quiet neighborhood. My heart started hammering. They were here, a massive, bright red cement mixer, even bigger than I'd imagined, crawled into view. It was a monster, and it was about to go one-on-one with a 100-year-old relic. The truck stopped at the bridge entrance. A guy in a hard hat hopped out and walked to the edge. He put his hands on his hips, looked at the wooden planks, then back at his colossal truck. He knew. You could see it on his face, even from my window. This was a bad idea. He pulled out his phone and made a call, gesturing wildly at the bridge, shaking his head. Through the binoculars, I could make out his panicked expression. He was clearly arguing with someone, a dispatcher, a foreman. No, you don't understand. This thing is ancient. I'm telling you, the planks are rotting. My liability? What about your liability if this thing goes in the creek? He was a total stranger with more common sense and integrity than my entire HOA board. Just then, a second cement truck rumbled up behind him, blocking any chance of turning back. The pressure was on. After another minute on the phone, the driver hung up, his face a mask of resignation. He slammed his truck door with a metallic clang that echoed in the quiet morning. This was happening. As he climbed back in, I saw my neighbor Sarah come out onto her porch, her hand over her mouth. Our eyes met across our lawns, a shared look of horrified disbelief. He put the truck in gear and started inching forward. The second the front tires hit the planks, a low, guttural groan echoed across the creek. It was the sound of old wood in agony. Dust and little pebbles of concrete shook loose from the underside. Through the binoculars, I could see the whole bridge visibly sag. Not a little dip, a terrifying bow in the middle. The driver crept forward, the engine roaring and the bridge screaming in protest. He was halfway across when it happened. A sound like a gunshot, a sharp, deafening crack that sliced through the morning air. It wasn't a groan. It was the sound of something fundamental breaking. Birds exploded out of the trees. The truck lurched violently to one side as the driver slammed the brakes, the screech of the tires mixing with the splintering wood. The whole rig was now tilted at a crazy angle. Its right front wheel had punched clean through the rotten timbers, wedging itself deep in the broken heart of the bridge. He was stuck. The cement truck was hopelessly, beautifully stuck, halfway across my dying bridge. It was the poetic justice I had secretly hoped for. Their cost-effective plan had just brought their entire project to a grinding, embarrassing halt on day one. The driver, looking pale, scrambled out of the cab, shouting into his phone. The second truck was blocked. The road was impassable, and their grand plan was now a disaster scene. And my cameras, hidden in the trees, had recorded every single glorious, incompetent second. The trap had sprung. My first impulse was to run outside, waving my emails and scream, "I told you so!" But I held back. Revenge is a dish best served cold. I just watched as total chaos unfolded. The foreman showed up in a pickup, his face a mask of pure fury. There was so much shouting. The best part was watching them try to figure it out. They couldn't just drive the truck off. They had to call in a massive heavy-duty tow truck, a wrecker even heavier than the cement mixer. The irony was just beautiful. To rescue the truck that was too heavy for the bridge, they had to bring in an even heavier one. Of course, they couldn't drive the wrecker onto the bridge. They had to stage it on the road and use a complex system of winches and cables. The whole process took hours, and in their frantic effort to free the truck, they did even more damage, tearing up the asphalt on the road and splintering the bridge entrance even more. It was a masterclass in compounding failure. About an hour into the chaos, a familiar car pulled up. It was Karen. She got out, saw the disaster, and then saw me watching from my porch. Her face hardened, and she marched across her lawn directly toward mine. "I hope you're happy," she snarled, stopping at the property line. "This entire project is now delayed because of you and your ridiculous alarmism. All this trouble you've caused." I just looked at her, then at the truck with its wheel through the bridge she claimed was perfectly safe, and then back at her. I didn't say a word. I just gave a slow, deliberate blink. The disconnect between her reality and actual reality was staggering. She huffed in frustration and stomped back to her car. While they were dealing with that mess, I slipped out the back and retrieved my evidence. I scrambled down the creek bed, grabbed my cameras and my little fallen piece of wood, and hurried back inside. My hands were shaking as I plugged the SD cards into my computer. The footage was perfect, better than I ever could have imagined. Camera 1 showed the truck's approach and the terrifying sag. Camera 3 caught the wheel breaking through in brutal detail. But Camera 2 was the smoking gun. Zoomed in on that crack, you could see everything. You could see the wood fibers straining like muscles, the crack widening in real time, and my little telltale piece of wood vibrating, wobbling, and then tumbling off its ledge at the exact moment of that loud crack. It was irrefutable. I spent the afternoon putting together the ultimate evidence package. I made a folder and named it The Reckoning. Inside went everything. My polite first email, Karen's dismissive reply, my request for the report, her refusal, the HOA meeting minutes where they ignored me, my before photos, and 3 separate video files, synced up to show the incident from every damning angle. The next morning, I walked over to Karen's house. She opened the door, and her face soured when she saw me. I hand-delivered a letter to her, formally requesting an emergency board meeting. I also CC'd Robert and Sarah and invited them to attend. Strength in numbers. "We'll see you in 2 days," I said calmly. 2 days later, we were back in the clubhouse. The mood was different. The air was thick with tension. No one was looking at their phones. They were all staring at me. Karen opened the meeting with a hostile tone. "We are aware of the minor incident on the bridge," she said, reading from a prepared statement. "Our contractor is handling it, and their insurance will cover the repairs, so I'm not sure what this is about." I didn't say a word. I just opened my laptop, turned it to face them, and hit play. I played the wide shot, then the close-up of the crack widening and the telltale falling, and finally, the shot of the truck trapped and helpless. The only sound in the room was the recording of their own negligence, the groaning wood, the final crack, the driver's panicked shouts. When it finished, I turned the laptop back. Karen's face was ashen. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by pure, cornered animal panic. Gary, the treasurer, had his head in his hands. The other board members were staring at the table, the walls, anywhere but at me. I slid a single piece of paper across the table. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a list of non-negotiable demands. All construction traffic is immediately and permanently rerouted. No exceptions. The HOA will immediately commission and pay for a full structural engineering assessment of the bridge from an independent firm that we help choose. The HOA will fully fund all repairs recommended by that assessment, as is their fiduciary duty. The board will issue a formal, written apology to all residents for knowingly endangering the community and misrepresenting the project's safety. Then, I delivered the final blow. "My lawyer has a copy of all of this," I said calmly. "He believes we have a clear case for gross negligence, which could be financially devastating for the HOA. He also mentioned that courts can, and do, hold board members personally liable in extreme cases of ignoring explicit warnings. And I have a feeling the local news would love to see the footage of your minor incident." Checkmate. The board crumbled. They had no power, no argument, no bluff left to call. The evidence was absolute. Within 48 hours, every demand was met. An email went out to the community announcing the rerouting of all construction vehicles. It had a stiff, lawyer-approved apology for the unforeseen incident. Not exactly heartfelt, but it was an admission of failure, in writing, for the entire neighborhood to see. The independent engineering firm they hired a week later was a brutal, glorious vindication. The report was scathing. It said the bridge was in an advanced state of decay, sending the truck across it constituted an extreme and unjustifiable risk, and that the initial plan showed a shocking disregard for basic safety protocols. The final sentence of the summary was my favorite. The structure was on the verge of imminent catastrophic failure. It certified the bridge as unsafe for anything heavier than a standard passenger car. I was right, and now I had a 50-page professionally stamped document to prove it. But the sweetest revenge was the money. The repairs were extensive and expensive, much more than the contractor's insurance would cover. The HOA's reserve funds weren't nearly enough, so the board had no choice but to levy a massive special assessment on every single homeowner to cover the cost of their incompetence. And Karen, as president, had to stand up at a packed emergency town hall meeting and explain to a room full of furious neighbors why their fees were suddenly skyrocketing. The clubhouse was overflowing. People were standing along the walls, their arms crossed. She tried to stick to her script, but the questions from the crowd were relentless. "You ignored a direct warning? Are you serious?" One man shouted. "My mother lives on that side of the creek," yelled another woman. "What if she had needed an ambulance?" Then Robert, the old-timer, stood up. His voice was steady and clear. I spoke to him after that meeting. I told him he was right. We all knew the bridge was weak. Many of us were just too afraid of this board to say anything. Not anymore. Karen had to stand there and take it. She had to admit the cost was to fix the damage from a plan she'd personally pushed through after ignoring direct warnings from a resident who had done his homework. The glares she got could have melted steel. She wasn't a queen anymore. She was just a petty tyrant facing the consequences of her own arrogance. It was beautiful. Needless to say, She and the entire Loyalist board were voted out in a landslide at the very next election. Today, the bridge is fully repaired, stronger and safer than ever, with a shiny new sign that clearly states the 4-ton weight limit. Our community is safer, and the new HOA board is a lot more transparent and responsive. I'm no longer the neighborhood crank. I'm the guy who saved the bridge. It just goes to show, sometimes you have to make a little trouble to protect your community. My genius trap didn't just catch them in the act, it forced them to finally do their jobs. Looking back, this whole thing started with one email and ended with holding an entire system accountable. It was a stressful, nail-biting experience, but it proved something I now believe to my core. One person, armed with persistence, good documentation, and a well-placed camera, can fight back against a negligent organization. Your rights as a homeowner aren't just about what color you can paint your door. They're about the right to live in a place where your safety isn't gambled with to save a few bucks. If this story helps even one person feel empowered to stand up to their own HOA or any bureaucracy that refuses to listen, then all the anxiety was worth it. Document everything. Be persistent. And don't ever be afraid to be the difficult one when safety is on the line. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the most powerful tool you have is a simple camera and the truth.